This edition of Monocle on Saturday was first broadcast on the 29th of June 2024. Hello, I'm Georgina Godwin, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. This is Monocle on Saturday. Coming up on today's programme, we'll have a look through the week's news and culture with international journalist and founder of China Dialogue, Isabel Hilton. Then,
how do we live in a politically polarised time without developing contempt? Because we get why they're angry. We came here because we're angry too.
Monocle's senior news editor Chris Cermak finds out how non-profit Braver Angels is fighting political polarisation in the United States. That's all ahead here on Monocle on Saturday. First though, here's the news. President Joe Biden said on Friday he intended to defeat Republican rival Donald Trump in the November presidential election, giving no sign he would consider dropping out of the race after a feeble debate performance that dismayed his fellow Democrats. Biden's verbal stumbles and occasionally meandering responses in the debate heightened voter concerns that he might not be fit to serve another four-year term. Kenyan activists have circulated calls for fresh protests, strikes and sit-ins demanding President William Ruto quit after nationwide demonstrations forced him to U-turn on proposed tax hikes. Ruto withdrew the contested finance bill on Wednesday and said he would listen to young people, a day after Parliament was briefly stormed and set ablaze, and at least 23 people were killed in clashes with police. And adding partners to the AUKUS defence project would be complicated, a senior Australian diplomat said on Friday, saying he didn't believe the US Congress is open to expanding the pact involving Australia, the US and Britain. AUKUS was formed in 2021 to counterbalance China's growing power. A first pillar involves cooperation between the three partners to provide Australia with nuclear-powered submarines, but they have raised the possibility of other countries joining a second pillar to develop other high-tech weaponry. And that's your Monocle Radio News. Hello and welcome to Monocle on Saturday, and I am joined in the studio by international journalist and founder of China Dialogue, Isabel Hilton. Good morning to you as well.
Good morning. How lovely to be here.
We've just been talking about China in the headlines, and of course that is your USP, as we might say. A couple of big stories coming out of China today. The Chinese Communist Party's expelled 2 ex-defence ministers. What's that all about?
2 defence ministers on one day. It was pretty spectacular. It wasn't a total surprise in that both men had disappeared, the most prominent being Li Shangfu, who was sacked in October as defence minister, thus disrupting the tentative renewal of US-China defence talks. And, you know, when people disappear like that, it's usually part of Xi Jinping's continuing anti-corruption drive. But the anti-corruption drive is also saying something else. It picks on political targets. Some of it, of course, is about corruption, which is endemic in the party. But the interesting thing about the continuing anti-corruption drive, and remember that Xi Jinping has now been in power since 2012, that he's now purging people he himself appointed and has been for some time. And when you do that in a sector as important as defence, at a moment of big geopolitical tensions, yes, of course, they will find, illicit funds in bank accounts because it's endemic in the army and the party. But what else was it that he was concerned about when these 2 men disappeared? He also decapitated the rocket force, which is the sort of missile part of the armed forces. And this amid rising tensions and speculation about China's intentions in Taiwan, and against a background of the discovery by the Russians, when they invaded Ukraine, that their armed forces were not really what they thought they were. Do you remember in the first wave of the full-scale invasion, there were vehicles breaking down, there were kind of missing kit. I mean, it was all very hollow. It looked all right on parade, but if you had to fight with it, it didn't work. So it may be that China has discovered this about its own armed forces, which, after all, haven't really fought a live war since they lost to Vietnam in the late 70s in what they called, in a wonderful bit of Chinese phraseology, the self-defensive counterattack against Vietnam, which was a minor invasion of Vietnam, and they got beaten back. So they're untested in a very real sense. They've been sending troops abroad on peacekeeping missions. They've been, trying to get some kind of sense of engagement in the field for some years. But they don't know until they push the button how real any of that is. And I think the nervousness about the armed forces, the nervousness about certainly the leadership of it, is a sign of that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's also a story coming out of Taiwan saying that they have issued a travel advisory telling citizens not to go there because China has threatened to execute separatists.
Yes. Well, if by separatists they mean anyone who voted for the DPP, well, that's quite a lot of people. And it's interesting. There are a large number of Taiwanese who have businesses in China, who work in China, and who are potential hostages in the event of an escalation. This is quite harsh. I have to say, although, execution is an extreme measure, Taiwan's not the only place that is advising its citizens to be very, very careful about going to China, because China has shown an increasing willingness to hold people hostage in unrelated disputes. And we saw that with the most notorious case, which was of 3 Canadian men who were seized and charged with espionage after the daughter of the major telecoms company was arrested in Canada at the request of the United States and was pending extradition to the United States on sanctions busting. So it's rather a convoluted case, but essentially it was hostage taking. The Americans had one person they wanted back. They seized 3 Canadians. Now, that could happen with a dispute between any of our governments and China. And I know a lot of people who just won't go anymore, or are nervous about going, or will only go with an absolutely rock-solid official invitation.
Yeah.
So there is nervousness, and certainly for the Taiwanese, who are, of course, much more exposed, it's probably sound advice.
Yeah. Let's move on and have a look at France, because it's the first round of the elections tomorrow. Now, of course, this poll came as a complete surprise, and people are still debating why President Macron thought that it would be a good idea.
He was never a man noted for excessive modesty, and he did win when, if you remember his first appearance on the stage, it was completely out of the blue. He was an insurgent candidate. He created a movement outside to France's 2 very established parties, which was essentially a goalless party on the right and the socialists on the left. And he blasted through the middle because there was a sort of sense that France was fed up with both of them. But now they're fed up with Macron. And I think he was slow to realise it. I think when you've done that once, it's quite hard to let go of the idea that you have a special relationship with the electorate. But now, of course, the big worry is Le Pen, who has been gaining ground, and a reconfiguration of French politics. So we have Macron's kind of centre conservatism disappearing. We have a resurgence of interest in the left and the socialists and to much lesser extent the Greens. But of course the big phenomenon, as it is elsewhere in Europe, is the rise of the hard right. And the way Le Pen has managed to make her party respectable in a way that her father never managed.
It is extraordinary. And if the National Rally wins the majority, we've got Bardella, who's just 28 years old, who will be asked to form a government.
Yes. Hard not to think that the effective Prime Minister will be, of course, Le Pen. A 28-year-old with no experience of any kind in government, at a time when, honestly, the world is pretty complicated, when France is pretty complicated. I'd be nervous if I were French. I'd be nervous if I were Bardella, frankly.
Exactly. Well, let's continue talking elections because, of course, it's fast approaching here in the UK.
Some would say not fast enough.
Absolutely. We had a debate which honestly really wasn't that interesting.
No, I must confess, for someone who is actually really, really interested in politics, I haven't been cancelling many social engagements this time to watch.
Yeah.
I catch up with them later, but the idea of sitting down, it's a bit like sitting down to watch Scotland play a World Cup match. Your heart, you have a preemptive bit of heart sinking before it starts. And, oh dear, nothing to lift the spirits, I'm afraid. And I don't honestly think it changes anyone's mind except to confirm that, we're fed up of all of them feeling, which is overtaking the nation.
I mean, the best part of the debate for me was a member of the audience saying, "Are you two the best that we can offer?" or something, words to that effect.
I have to say the British electorate have a way of coming up with memorable phrases. Do you remember that woman who said, "Oh no, not again," when the news was broken of a previous election? And this has resonated down the years, as I suspect will that audience member's remark.
Now, Politico says that Keir Starmer lost the debate, but will still win the UK election. I think there's no doubt that he will win the election. Do you think he lost the debate?
Well, I think it's very hard to say. I mean, he is almost a charisma-free zone. And you just have to feel that Sunak is, already drowning and didn't really make it to shore either. It's hard to say that either man won the debate, and it may well, as I say, it may well not have changed anyone's mind. So what does winning the debate mean in those circumstances? I think what Labour are very nervous about is allowing the assumption that they're going to have a landslide to gain ground, because nobody's terribly captivated by Labour. And so the worry is that people will just assume they're going to win and stay home.
Yeah.
And that could be a problem for them, actually. I think, a kind of the indifference party is going to make some gains here, and they are nervous about that.
Yeah.
Because this is not 1997, this is not a great surge of enthusiasm as we saw for Tony Blair. He hasn't captivated that. His team are very competent, he has a deep bench, but they haven't managed, they've been so cautious about their policies that they have failed to engage the national imagination. So it's they should be a bit nervous.
Politico says it's talking about how Labour's on course to win with a landslide on July the 4th. He says on those kind of numbers you'd expect Churchill, JFK and Taylor Swift rolled into one, not a 60-something bespectacled lawyer blinking in the spotlight.
Yeah, well put.
We just have to discuss Taylor Swift for a moment, because it can't have escaped your notice that she's been in London.
Indeed, and I do feel there was a famous case in the 60s of a High Court judge who didn't know who the Beatles were, and I do, as I get older, increasingly feel an affinity with that gentleman. Of course, I do know who Taylor Swift is, but have I been singing her songs for years? I'm afraid not. She's an extraordinary phenomenon, and good for her.
I mean, the fame of her is extraordinary.
I think I haven't seen anything like it, actually. Yeah. I mean, she is bigger than the Beatles. She's bigger than Dylan. And she's a relatively young woman, singing often quite feminist songs. So you have to say, good on you.
Absolutely. And just the amount of joy that she seems to have spread. I mean, everybody I've spoken to who's been to her concerts has said how absolutely amazing it was. And these are people, I mean, often mothers taking their daughters who'd never really noticed her much before, but coming away from it going, it was the most amazing experience.
And indeed, fathers taking their daughters. Yeah. And I think part of it is that her fan base is so devoted that they sing with her. And they sing with her for 2 and 3 hours. So it's like a kind of revival meeting, which is also famously good for the endorphins. So she's, she is the secular religious movement. It's extraordinary. Yeah.
Now, she was originally sort of slightly co-opted by the Republicans. She was seen as a bit of a, cowgirl type and beloved of MAGAs. Although I think she's since shrugged that off. But let's look at what's happening there, because the US debate, oh my goodness, if the British one was boring, that one was cringingly embarrassing to watch.
That was one to watch from well behind the sofa, wasn't it? It was so painful. And given how Biden then recovered in the rally, I mean, it's quite clear that he's all right when he's got a teleprompter. But, as president, you don't have a teleprompter for world crises necessarily. So it was just awful. And, of course, the Republicans will go on playing those clips ad infinitum, and I would too if I was on the Trump side.
Up until now, any sort of evidence of Biden looking slightly wobbly or whatever, I thought had been possibly media manipulation and, shots cropped unfavourably and things, but that just left one in no doubt that really he probably shouldn't run.
Well, indeed, he shouldn't. But again, I fear that Biden's vanity is going to... Well, Biden's vanity and the difficulty at this point of swapping horses. If they felt they couldn't swap horses last year because it would be too contentious and they would just get into a terrible civil war in the party, imagine trying to do it now. But of course, we're now seeing, I think, all the coverage that I have watched of the aftermath of the debate is about panic in the Democratic Party. It's about people texting each other in the course of the debate saying, oh my God, we have to do something. And immediately after the debate, there was an interview with the very, very young and vigorous governor of California, Gavin Newsom, who was coherent, fluent, good-looking, on the case, utterly loyal to Biden. But you really, you couldn't help but think he would smash it. And if there was only a mechanism for getting from Biden to Gavin Newsom, we could all sleep easier, frankly.
Because, just looking at some of the media reports, so Russian media says Biden was a total failure. Then we go to Chinese media said that it was like a reality show. Lots of cartoons about it in China. Indian media highlighted the aggression of Trump. Israel talks of Biden's weakness. Latin America says Biden hesitant and confused. Mexican media cite nest of rats comment by Trump.
Yes, that was a pretty unsavoury one.
Really, really unpleasant. Turkish media says a new Trump era is approaching. Are they right?
Well, they could be. Of course, everyone says, it's a long time till election day, but the problem with the time argument is that time is not on Biden's side from the evidence that we have. And from the global reaction, if you look at the context of geopolitics now, the Russian and Chinese narrative is about the decline of democracy and the decline of the United States. And I have to say that was obviously going to feed that narrative. And for the Americans, the American president is kind of an avatar for the American people. They vote for people who they think embody what they imagine their nation to be at this point. And that is also pretty worrying. You really wouldn't want to feel that your nation was summed up by Biden in that performance, quite separately from the fact that, yes, he's been a quite good and effective president, for which he's not getting credit. But for another 4 years on that performance, you just wouldn't want it.
Absolutely not. So the debate on Thursday between Biden and Trump marked a low point in American politics, and in particular, perhaps, for Biden's own campaign, as we've been discussing. But there remain groups in the US that are trying to bring political opponents together. So one such group is called Braver Angels. It's been holding its annual convention this week in Wisconsin, bringing together conservatives and liberals for conversation and debate. And as part of its convention, Braver Angels hosted a watch party for Thursday night's debate. Well, Monocle's Chris Cermak spoke to Jessie Mannisto, who's director of debates at Braver Angels. He began by asking her why she organised the watch party.
Well, we didn't know what to expect. We've never done anything like this before, but we knew that there would be feelings. Let's just say feelings, whatever happened, because you can't predict what's going to be said, but there's going to be something that is going to upset somebody. And so we set it up to say, hey, we believe in depolarization, which I'd like to define as the personal defeat of political hatred. We are here because we are curious about each other. We all know what we think about Joe Biden and Donald Trump. If you've been paying attention for the last 8 years, you have your opinion about them already. But we are in this space because we want to know what each other thinks. And so we went into it thinking, all right, we're going to ask people some questions. We're going to give people some space to talk. And we're just going to remind people, be curious about each other. And when you felt anger, when you felt fear, how would you like other people to receive that? What would you like to take away from that? And what would you like to take from witnessing other people's responses? And what we ended up taking away from it was there was a lot of unhappiness in that room on both sides, and that ended up uniting people. It's a sad thing, but it is something to connect over. Nobody's happy with where we're at right now.
I guess it's not a surprise, even if you were bringing red and blue, as you call them, individuals into one room together, that really both sides were disappointed with their candidate at this point. I mean, it is interesting that you offer a little bit of inspiration there. I mean, I read a quote from the debate from an LA Times columnist who said, there are train wrecks that offer more inspiration and uplift than this debate did. But it sounds like you're giving us some inspiration, but what kind of agreement was there then if both sides are unhappy about what they kind of want to see happen right now for the country?
What we want are better candidates because we believe in our system. You know, think back to Barack Obama versus John McCain in 2008. My impression from back then was that we had our favorite candidate, but the other guy would have been okay. We respected the other guy. That's within the memory of most of us who are at this convention. And people remembering that can look in this red-blue watch party at people from the other side saying, hey, they're not any happier than I am. Maybe we can come together and do something for this country. Maybe we don't have to focus on these two candidates who make us feel so sad. One of the things that was fascinating, because we took comments during the commercials, we had our MC surveying the crowd, getting reactions, because otherwise, why watch it together? We were curious about each other. The most surprising thing for me was that we had comments from people, one on each side, a Biden voter who was so discouraged with Biden that she said she had to switch to Trump, and vice versa, a Trump voter who was so fed up with Trump that he was going to switch to Biden. And that really surprised me. You don't get the impression people change their minds at these things, but this is the state we're in. People are trying to figure out the best of bad options.
Now, Jessie, you are at this convention of Braver Angels in Kenosha, Wisconsin. There's a whole bunch of events going on that are trying to tackle the polarization that we have in the U.S. You did mention there for the debate last night a lot of frustrations. The general agreement, if there was one, was we need better candidates. Absent that, given that it's unlikely at this point that we will have better candidates, just tell us about some of the things you're discussing there, what kind of hopes there are for improving the situation, the political situation in the United States as it stands.
There were some people advocating for more local engagement because so much of what affects our lives really does happen at the local level, people trying to step up, which if you look forward, maybe that's how we do get better candidates down the line at state and local levels. Civic renewal is an idea that really inspires people here. How do we participate? If we can't trust our top leadership, then we take it upon ourselves. And so a lot of our panels here are people who just want to figure out how they can do that. People feel motivated to try to make things better. And we don't all know how to do it, but maybe if we come together, we can brainstorm some of those things. And so we have a lot of panels touching on the issues that do rile people up, that do stir emotions, that do inspire action. We have panels on, is it racist to be colorblind? We have a panel on transgender care and the various perspectives on that, which of course is a toxic issue here in the States especially. We have perspectives on the class divide. Is that more important than the other divides that get more attention? We're doing common ground workshops in addition to our debates. Common ground workshops are where you must come up with what is shared between the red and the blue. What do we agree on? What can we share? Are we really so far apart as we believe ourselves to be? And so those are the things we're doing here at the convention.
Just to follow that up, I wonder what happens now after the convention. If you could talk a little about, this convention, you could make some argument that people who go to the convention, you're sort of preaching to the choir. These are people who want to understand what's happening and sort of come together from both sides. How is Braver Angels going about expanding beyond that and reaching those people who really are angry right now about what's happening and are not necessarily coming together?
That is such a good question. And we think about that so much. How do we scale this up? How do we convince people? Because, of course, this debate watch party worked because the people who self-selected into it were a certain type of person. But things like these common ground workshops and things like our debates where we say, no, we really mean it when we say we want to hear what you think. We bring in new people who are angrier. Debate chairs are trained to moderate these in such a way that we respond to people who haven't bought into our model. And it's a slow process, person to person, but it really is just a model of giving people a sense of how to get involved. Again, local politics, school boards, whatever else you could do to be out there and just represent this thing that we call the Braver Angels Way, which is a model of demonstrating how do we live in a politically polarized time without developing contempt. Because I think everybody, those angry people you talked about, we get why they're angry. We came here because we're angry too. And so if we speak to that anger and we say, we're right there with you, come with us, we're trying something, this just might work. That's our plan.
That's Jessica Mannisto, who is Braver Angels Director of Debates, in conversation with our senior news editor, Chris Cermak. I mean, there is so much anger, isn't there, Isabel?
There's a lot of anger, but I do also find it very encouraging that civic-minded, democracy-loving citizens are angry enough with what they see in the leadership to want to rebuild democracy from below and civic discourse from below. And that, the degree to which the standards of public debate have fallen, in my view, because of Trump, he has dragged down public debate. We talked about how feeble Biden looked, but the fact checking on Trump's claims, it was just one lie after another, and he really does the Goebbels thing that if you repeat a lie often enough, it kind of becomes a truth, and he has destroyed standards of public debate in the United States. And what's encouraging about groups like that, whichever side they're on, is that they just want decency and honesty back in public life. And I think there's an enormous appetite for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, the New York Times has a piece pointing out how the debates in the UK and the US differ very sharply in tone and substance. They're saying that leaders in their prime debate substance and detail. No, not the US, they're saying. So they're actually giving Sunak and Starmer higher marks than Biden and Trump. And not surprisingly, it was much, much more civilised. And they did actually talk about some real things. We've moved on, as the article points out, from the kind of squabbling over Brexit and now talking about real things like tax and so on.
Well, that's true, although there are a lot of real things that happened as a result of Brexit that aren't being talked about. So, there is a kind of, it's become a no-go area when it's probably still the most significant influence on the economy, for example. And that's a problem, but that's a problem Labour will have to address once they're safely past the election. I think in British politics, the kind of Trump-style mendacious and extremist rhetoric is the province largely of our own far right, the Reform Party, Nigel Farage and his followers. And at the same time as the debate has been credited with relative civility, we've had a series of scandals about things that Reform candidates have said or are alleged to have said, which are very much kind of on the spectrum of racism, misogyny and all those undesirable things that we've seen return under Trump and under the far right. So it's not that British politics is free of it. It's just that as yet it hasn't made it to kind of centre stage on the leadership debate.
Absolutely. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so let's talk about books.
Ooh, yes.
In our headlines, we were talking about the unrest in Kenya, and I just wanted to tell everybody that the NBO the Hay Festival and NBO Festival going on in Nairobi at the moment is still going on. It's not been affected. It's all kind of happening. Lots of amazing people there. Bernardine Evaristo, Amitav Ghosh, David Olaswega, Aminata Fauna, many, many writers from across Africa. And it's going on all weekend. And people, if they're not there, can join it online. But there's another festival here in Britain that you've just returned from.
I have. I went to... And And by the way, I think it's wonderful that event in Kenya is still happening, because of course, lots of people had to cancel because of the unrest. So good for them.
Absolutely.
And actually also good for Bradford. Bradford is a town that gets a lot of stick in this country. Once the richest town in Britain, now one of the poorest. It's a kind of story of Britain in many ways. And it's also the youngest city in Britain and the most diverse. And all of this is on view in the Bradford Literature Festival, which was celebrating its 10th anniversary this year, started by a young Asian woman and another friend of hers, also a young Asian woman. And it's an absolute phenomenon. You and I go to a lot of literary festivals, and I love them. They do tend to be quite white and quite middle-aged. The Bradford Literary Festival is utterly different. It feels different. You know, it absolutely engages its community, including, it's got a fantastic children's programme, and it's talking about issues that are of enormous concern to Bradford in a way that, you know, they don't get discussed in London, because the constituent, it really is about, if you have different people in the room, you get a different conversation.
Yes.
And that's why I find it so interesting.
Yeah. So that's in fact going on until the 7th of July. So people...
Hurry up to Bradford, but the train service is awful, people, so allow yourself a little margin.
Isabel, thank you very much indeed. That's all we've got time for on Monocle on Saturday. Thanks also to our producer and studio engineer, Mariella Bevan. Monocle on Saturday will return next weekend. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thanks for listening.